이렇게 꼬셔가지고 이렇게 오시기로 한 거고요. 그래서 저기 JP 니콜스 오셨고요. JP 니콜스는 시애틀에서 오셨고요. 20년 동안 그 미국의 US 뱅크라는 그런 그 큰 은행에서 이렇게 오랫동안 일을 하셨고, 지금은 여러 가지 그 핀테크, 뱅킹, 이노베이션에 관한 그런 컨설팅을 하시면서 예, 굉장히 많이 이렇게 좀 트래블을 다니시면서 많이 강연도 하시고 글도 쓰시고 책도 내시고 좀 그런 예, 분이라고 합니다. 그래서 지금 그 JP 니콜스는 지금 퓨처 이 뱅킹에 대해서 간단히 한 10여 분 말씀을 해주실 거고요. 그리고 오신 김에 여기 우리 그 마커스 근혁이라고 싱가포르에서 예, 왔었는데 저번에 한국에 와가지고 한국의 그 핀테크 스타트업들을 싱가포르에 있는 그 스타트업부캠 핀테크에 이렇게 리크루트하는 거를 했었어요. 네, 그래서 한국의 그런 핀테크 스타트업 외에 전 아시아를 다 다니면서 이렇게 원래 독일 출신이고 런던에서 핀테크 스타트업 부캠에서 일을 하다가 싱가포르로 옮긴 지는 한 그 4, 5개월 정도 이렇게 됐습니다. 그래서 마커스도 같이 간단한 프레젠테이션을 하고 이렇게 같이 앉아서 이야기를 할 거고요. 제가 뭐 질문하기보다는 여러분들이 그냥 질문을 처음부터 이렇게 받고 편하게 한 2, 30분 이야기를 한 다음에 그 다음에 그냥 바로 자기소개하고 이렇게 믹스하는 시간을 가지려고 합니다. 네. Please welcome Mr. JP Nicols.
감사합니다. 안녕. I hope English is okay from here on out because I've used just about all of my Korean. So, thank you for having me today.
Yeah, it would be better if you speak really slowly.
I will try to speak slowly. I am an American. I speak very fast. But I'll try to slow down. But thank you for having me. And Jungwook, feel free to interpret if needed. If I say anything too fast or too confusing. So I spent most of my career as a banker, and for the past 3 years I've been helping banks and fintech companies work together and helping banks innovate. So the perspective I'm going to bring is somewhat from the banks, the perspective of the banks, what's happening in the banking industry and what's happening in fintech. Markus will talk a little bit from the other way, from the fintechs. Some fintechs are working with banks, some are working directly with customers. But in either case, the industry is being changed and the consumers are being changed. I like to say that the banks were undefeated. They had a perfect record for hundreds of years. But you notice we have an asterisk at the end of our record. And the reason is because we won every game by default. Of course we won. We made the rules. Nobody could compete with us. We only competed with ourselves. We only competed with other banks. We competed with each other, and each one of us was really a gatekeeper. If you wanted to borrow money, or save money, or invest money, or move money from one place to another, you needed to come through one of us as a gatekeeper. You paid us a toll, and we allowed the transaction to go through. But think about how that has changed. Think about how just about every business that's been in a gatekeeper model has changed. Think about YouTube and publishing. If you wanted to have a television show, you had to go to one of the major networks and go through a talent agent, and it would be very, very unlikely that you could get your television show on the air. Now you don't need any gatekeeper. You don't need anyone's permission. You can just make your own video in your basement and upload it to YouTube, and the market will decide whether people want to see that or not. Right? So all forms of gatekeeper kinds of economies are beginning to break down, and is becoming democratized, and people are able to deal with each other in more of a one-to-one basis. So this has been great news for the consumers. It's not such good news for the banks. So the banks had a really tough year in 2008. It was the beginning of the global financial crisis. But it's also about the same time as we began to see more broadband, more smartphones, social media, bigger use of data and analytics. So the whole game has changed. So that gatekeeper model and the banks competing with the banks has now changed. So we're in a whole different era now, but most of the banks still don't even know it yet. If you've ever taken a Western business course, you probably learned about Porter's 5 forces. Michael Porter was a professor at Harvard Business School. And I could talk about each one of these things. I could talk about supplier power. And I would argue that supplier power today has a lot to do with regulations. The regulations control our supply. They control the money supply, the cost of the money supply. And increasingly, they control what kinds of products we can sell and to whom. As you know, in Korea, the FSC says that there are significant restrictions on non-banks owning banks and on banks owning non-banks. We're starting to see early signs that that will begin to change. We're seeing regulatory changes in all different kinds of places. Perhaps Marcus will talk a little bit about Singapore, where the regulators have been very involved, and I'll be running a panel next week at Next Bank Asia with the Singapore Monetary Authority, talking about the way regulations need to step up and be more modern for the consumer. So that's supplier power, and I could talk about the threat of new entry, and I could talk a little bit about the buyer power. You think of the customer today as more powerful than ever. They're better educated. They have access to more information. They're better connected. They trust social media. So that gatekeeper model kind of assumes that we on the other side of the gate know everything and you have to pay us to get through. I already mentioned that's changing, but what I think is really important and what's really powerful right now is the threat of substitution. Because you see, that did not exist before. There was no threat of substitution if you were a bank. You could just go to another bank, but all the banks are pretty much the same, right? Now that's really beginning to change. So what happens when our map doesn't match the landscape? So this map is from 65 AD. Is it a very accurate map? No, not in a lot of ways, particularly not if you're from Asia. It doesn't look very accurate at all from the Asian perspective or from the African perspective, let alone the Americas. This is a decidedly European and Roman map. A friend of mine from Italy says it's pretty accurate, actually. It looks just fine to him. So it wasn't very accurate if you were going to use to navigate. I suppose it may have been accurate in terms of defining us versus them. This group of people versus that group of people. But notice also that all around the edges is the water. That was the view. We live on the land, out there is water, and beyond which there is an edge, beyond which there is tremendous risk. So imagine in the year 500 or maybe the year 1000, 3 ships setting sail, 3 entrepreneurs who say, I'm not sure I believe that that's really the edge. I want to explore for myself. I want to see what's out there. So imagine the first ship leaves port just a little bit earlier before the other 2. It has the sails trimmed just right, so it starts to open up a lead between the other 2 ships. This progresses throughout the morning, and by the afternoon, the second 2 ships only see the tip of the sail, and then eventually just the very top of the mast, and then eventually the whole ship drops below the horizon. But what do the people on the other 2 ships think happened there? They think it's sailed off the edge, right? Because that's what they were told. This is the map that they look at. They think that those crazy people in that first ship sailed across the edge. So what do the people in those first two ships do? They turn right around and go back, right? I don't want that to happen to me. I told those crazy entrepreneurs they shouldn't have tested the edge. We're going to go back. It wouldn't be for almost 2,000 years that we would really get an accurate picture of what the world looked like. And think about how we got this picture. We actually had to leave the Earth, right? First with satellites and later with manned spacecraft to look back and take a picture of the Earth. And the reason I tell this story, I spend a lot of time talking to bankers and I say, if this is your map, how accurate is it really? If you think B-A-N-K is all there is to banking today, I think you're really missing it because I don't think your map matches the current landscape. So there are companies like Simple and Moovin and others who are redefining what the borders look like, redefining what banking really means. How many people are familiar with Simple? Have you heard of it? Okay. There's a company that was launched a couple of years ago in the United States, and they were acquired last year by BBVA, the large Spanish bank, for 117 million US dollars. Not a bad little start. How about Moovin? Have you heard of Moovin? So Brett King, a lot of you may have read, if you follow the banking and fintech space, you may have heard of Brett King. He's written a book called Bank 2.0 and now another Bank 3.0. So both of those companies now, originally they were started to go directly to consumers, and now they actually partner with banks because these companies have figured out a better way to deal with the customer. And so in Simple's case, one bank bought them. In Moovin's case, they're partnering now with banks all around the globe. And they predict by the end of this year, they'll have 15 to 20 million people using their platform. But if you look at what's happening in payments, is payments a part of banking? I think so. If you look at what Amazon is doing, or Apple Pay, or Starbucks, or Uber. How many people have used Uber? Quite a few. What I always like to ask is, do you know what I like most about the payment experience about Uber? There isn't one. There is no payment experience. I don't want a payment experience. I want a ride. I want to go from point A to point B. And when I'm done, I want to say thank you. I'm done. And that's what happens with Uber. Right? There's no payment experience. Same thing is happening in Starbucks. I'm from Seattle. Both Starbucks and Amazon are from Seattle. And Starbucks today, on my Starbucks app, I can not only pay, same thing, I don't want a payment experience, I want a coffee experience. Or in my case, iced tea. Please don't tell anyone in Seattle that I don't drink coffee. I'll be kicked out. But now they're testing, I can actually order ahead of time. So I can order from my app, it remembers the favorite drinks that I have, and when I come in, I really have no payment experience. I just walk in and pick up the drinks and move on. So it's very interesting. So you see how the landscape is changing and how bankers are not thinking about these kinds of things. Bankers are still thinking about banker things. It's a whole new landscape for that. So this website, CB Insights, took the Wells Fargo website, looked at all of the different offerings that they have on their website, and mapped fintech companies that now provide the same services. Every single business that Wells Fargo is in, frankly, every single business that KB Bank and every other bank is in, is now under assault. At least that's the way they feel like it. They feel like it's an assault. But it's also an opportunity because many of these companies, as I mentioned, will partner with the banks also. How many folks have read the book, The Innovator's Dilemma, or heard of it at least a few? So this is another Harvard business professor, Clayton Christensen. He wrote this book in 1997. And I usually make the joke that part of the new regulations since the global financial crisis said that if you say the words bank and innovation in the same sentence, that you must be sure to talk about Clayton Christensen's book. It's a joke, it's not really true, but it seems like it. People are mentioning it a lot, and I've mentioned it myself. I wrote about it a couple of years ago in American Banker. It's the biggest financial daily in the United States. And the point of the innovator's dilemma is when you run an existing business and you have real live customers and you have real live profits, why would you divert any of those profits towards something new and unproven? It is a dilemma, isn't it? Well, in the book, Christensen talks about the steel industry. And in the 1980s, there was only one way to make steel. It was through great big, giant, integrated steel manufacturing plants. It was very expensive. At that time, it cost well over $1 billion to create and manage a steel manufacturing plant. But new technology emerged called mini mills. A mini mill could produce steel for 1/10 the cost of a traditional integrated steel manufacturer. There was just one catch. They could only make one kind of steel. They could only make rebar. Rebar is that kind of cheap steel that gets buried inside of concrete, right? It's the stuff underneath the floor here and up in the ceiling. It's a low-grade kind of steel. So the steel industry actually thought this was good news because that was a very low margin, low profit margin business. It was a commodity. But pretty soon, the mini mills got more efficient, more profitable, invested those profits, and they could make then steel rods and angle iron and structural steel and I-beams. So within a few years, there was only one kind of steel left to make, and that was flat-rolled steel. That was the most expensive, the highest quality steel. But eventually, mini mills figured that out, and today, most of the steel made in the world is made through a mini mill process, and most of the large integrated steel manufacturing plants filed for bankruptcy, have massive layoffs, major restructuring. So the point as it relates to fintech is this. We're still in the rebar stage in fintech. Those companies that we just saw on the screen a couple of minutes ago, in many cases are still pretty early stage companies. Some of them are moving on quite a long way. How many folks have heard of Lending Club? A few of you. So Lending Club, a lot of you. P2P lending, which we're not able to do in Korea today. I'm hopeful that will change. And peer-to-peer lending, increasingly they're calling themselves marketplace lenders, because it's not always peer-to-peer. Oftentimes now it's institutional money lending out to individuals. But they've now done over $16 billion of loans, US. They did $1.8 billion US last quarter. And when I talk to rooms full of bankers like this, I ask the bankers, how many of you did $1.8 billion of loans last quarter? And not very many hands go up. So in some cases, we're moving along pretty quickly. In other cases, it's still pretty early stage. But fintech is definitely hot. This is the amount of investment, again in US dollars. In 2013, it was about 4 billion US dollars invested. And at that time, they were saying, wow, this is really starting to explode. We might get to 8 billion 5 years from now. It didn't take that long. It went through 8 billion and it was up to 12 billion already last year. So we're really beginning to see a ramp up. You can see most of the investment is in the United States, followed by Europe, primarily the UK. but we're starting to see other hotspots emerge. Marcus will talk about Singapore. Singapore probably leading Asia at the moment, but Hong Kong is not very happy about that, and they're looking to invest, and they're taking government money to invest and encourage fintech investment. I hope we see a lot of competition coming from Seoul. You have a tremendous technology community here. You have great hardware, you have great networks, and being able to build on that to create fintech solutions, I think is a great opportunity in this market. So, in conclusion, why does all of this matter? Well, in the United States, maybe 20 years ago, the Kodak Film Company had an advertising campaign that talked about a Kodak moment. And the advertising meant that Kodak Film captured those special moments in your life. Unfortunately, now it means something very different. Kodak is a company that doesn't exist anymore. It was the leader of an industry that for all intents and purposes doesn't really exist anymore. Right? The physical celluloid film business. And so, is banking headed for a Kodak moment? I think we are. And you know, Kodak was not surprised to find out that such a thing as digital photography existed. They knew this. They knew that there was digital photography. To some degree, they ignored it. To some degree, they thought, well, that crazy little tiny camera on a telephone is never going to replace these high-quality photos that I could take, you know, with my big film camera. And boy, has that changed, right? The quality that you have in all of your phones today is probably better than any camera you owned before in your life. And to another extent, even when they didn't ignore it, they were unable to make the changes necessary inside the organization. Because the whole business was wired around being a film manufacturer. And that's just not where the industry is anymore. So my point is to bankers, well, where's the banking industry going to go? And if you're still wedded to running branches with branch hours and gathering deposits and making loans, I think those activities will always be around. I think we'll always have banks. I think we'll always have banking. But my question to bankers are we sure we're going to have your bank around? We'll always have some banks, but maybe your bank doesn't survive. The banks that will survive will be the ones that adapt, the ones that innovate, and the ones that partner and embrace fintechs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marcus, and then I think we'll stick around for questions and answers after that. So thank you very much.
Hey guys, I'm Markus from Startupbootcamp Fintech. It's great to be back in Korea. So I was here in February, I think, running a Fintech pitch day with DCAM, Startup Alliance, and Fintech Forum. So it's great to be back and to see many familiar faces already again. So yeah, thanks for coming. Very quickly, as I hadn't really prepared much, I was just invited yesterday, share a few more thoughts from the startup point of view. After JP talked about the banking side of fintech, I would touch more on the startups in the fintech world. Please interrupt me if you have any questions. I will take you through a few slides, but also just really talk about what I see across Asia happening in fintech. I'm based in Singapore now, where I would say fintech is happening in the last also 8 months, 9 months, similar to Korea. And I was before that in London, being part of the whole fintech hype, some call it. And it's good to see what's going on now in Asia as well, following the trends from America and Europe. So Startup Bootcamp Fintech, very, very quickly, to give you a bit of a context who we actually are. And a few of you already had the same slide in February, so I don't want to repeat myself again. But Startup Bootcamp Fintech is an industry that, it's a company that bridges the gap between the banks and the startups. Banks are really, really scared. Yeah? And we heard just from JP what banks are now doing, or starting to do. They just don't know how to do it sometimes. People like JP help them. Well, then they hear all these different new startups, this whole new world outside the banking building, where the bankers in their suits and ties sit in the bank but don't know actually how to talk to startups because there's like these funny animals outside the banking building. On the other side, you have startups. Yeah, you guys here, sitting in co-working spaces, hacking your day and night away, building prototypes, building new solutions, but actually don't know how to work with the bank. You don't have the access to the right people in the bank. You don't know actually how to enter the bank, how to sell to the bank. So we think Startup Bootcamp is one of the solutions to be in the middle, to connect these two worlds, the banks and the startups in the fintech world. We're doing this in so-called acceleration programs, and I believe the incubator accelerator word is also now very popular here in Korea. So we are one of the leading fintech accelerators worldwide, in London and Singapore. Very soon we're also going to be in New York, so watch the space, and starting to look into the Indian market and South America as well. So we are, domination is our plan. Anyway, so we do these programs like any other incubator accelerator. We take 10 fintech startups into a 13 weeks program where we have 13 industry partners. So we are supported by the industry. Normally there's a slide with all the nice logos on our partners, but I will spare you with this slide. So we have partners like MasterCard, DBS Bank, Lloyds Bank, Rabobank, so large banks in UK, Netherlands, Italy, Singapore, who are supporting our initiative, actually funding it, putting some cash into us to make it all happen. Also the Singapore government is involved. We have large VC funds, so venture capitalists, SBT Venture Capital and Route 66 Ventures, large VC funds focusing on the fintech investment side, working with us because they want to be close to these 10 fintech startups. And I always want to make this point that there's one community. And the fintech community is quite small. That's also one of the things that JP said. It's always important to have a community around you. People, mentors, angels, experts, investors to support these 10 teams. So we are coming from the 10 teams. That's very important for us. We do this in these acceleration programs. So why I was in Korea in February was because to see what's going on in Korea and to see if there are actually any startups that want to join our program in Singapore. We've done this now across Asia. We went to 14 different locations now to meet fintech startups. We went all the way to Japan, Korea, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur was a great trip, India. Yeah? So we went all the way across Asia to meet fintech startups to see who can actually make the cut to be the top 10 fintech teams. I have to disappoint you, none Koreans. Yeah? But we have 10 teams now. They are the third week of the program. And I'm pretty sure one of these, or a few of these, will be the next big lending club or TransferWise and all the stars you hear about. So please remember these logos. Yeah? You can say in a few years' time, Markus told me about them. Yeah? And they're representing very different fintech trends. Yeah? I'm not going into too much detail per team, but just to show you a few, give a bit of example what's going on and what we see happening in fintech. We have 3 blockchain startups. So 3 startups using the blockchain technology to underlying the whole Bitcoin currency. So Ebony, Crypto-Sigma, and Autonomous are using the blockchain technology. As an example, Autonomous is making it possible to fund, incorporate, and govern a company on the blockchain. Yeah. Normally, if you want to start a company, you have to go to the company house or to some kind of ministry to register a company. But with Autonomous, it is very easy to do it on the blockchain. We have BWH Trading there on the left, which is doing social trading. Yeah? Making it easy for you individuals to actually do your own trading, not anymore just using brokerage firms and large banks. You can do it online and follow other famous traders and actually be part of the success. Dragon wealth is in the wealth management. Huge potential in Asia. There's so much wealth created across Asia. So many people moving to the middle class but don't want to anymore go to the bank, have their own wealth manager. They want to have an app where you simply can actually see what's going on with your wealth. So Dragon Wealth is a startup that's focusing exactly on that. Connecting the masses, the affluent masses, with wealth management. Look them up. It's all great teams. They're all on the third week of the program, and they're making good progress. And I fly back tonight to take care of them again. It's like having 10 babies sometimes. Anyway, quickly touching on a few fintech trends, and also just these are a few things on a slide with Wells Fargo. We see a lot of things happening driven by the consumers, especially in Asia, where banking crisis 2008 was a main epiphany moment for the West. In 2008, many banks in the UK and in the States had a bit of an issue, laid off many people, and I think that's where really the fintech trend started, especially in London, where 8,000 employees from RBS were laid off one day after the other. What did they do? They started companies. So since 2008, and because I was in London, I can tell a lot more about this. Since 2008, you see a lot of startups happening in fintech because they left the banks. It's a bit different in Asia, though, and I think that's very interesting because in Asia, there was no such crisis, at least not in Singapore, where the last 10 years, the banks make profit 30% every year. It's insane. The government plays a very important role. Similar in Korea. The president last year announced fintech to be on the agenda. In Singapore, in India, in Kuala Lumpur, it's where the government says we have to do something about financial innovation. Let's get the banks and the regulators on board to make this innovation happen. And now the banks pick it up, and we all come together a bit more. For me, exciting is to see what's going on in Malaysia, Indonesia, all these other emerging markets where there's a real pain. Millions of people don't have a bank account. I think in India itself, it's 400 million people not having a bank account. 400. They don't have access to anything. Loans, mortgages, payments, nothing. So there's a real pain. What can you do to give these 400 million people solutions to actually give them access to the infrastructure of the bank? Similar in the Philippines, similar in Myanmar. Lots of consumers are waiting for fintech solutions. A bit different than the ones in the West. More buzzwords on the right. A few more trends. JP also said about payments yesterday on the panel with us with Alipay and Samsung Pay. Big trends happening, definitely. Financial inclusion, very important for India and all the emerging markets that I mentioned. Giving the unbanked people access to innovation. Then the back office, the very, very boring bits of the bank, like capital markets, like trade finance. All these very inefficient processes in the bank that are changing now slowly. And we see more and more startups in Asia picking these trends up and actually bringing up solutions for the back office. For me personally, very exciting is the blockchain technology. And I would claim out of all these trends, probably the only really disruptive one. All these other solutions are efficiency gains, disintermediation, another level to add to the existing infrastructure. But the only disruptive one is the freaking blockchain. Wealth is another trend I see a lot happening in Asia. So it's a few of the most important ones. Quickly on the locations, on the left, you see the ones that I pointed out are more active. Singapore, Hong Kong, Mumbai, Seoul, and Shanghai. You see a lot of fintech startups. It's probably most likely due to the involvement of the banks and the government. Singapore and Seoul is today, here 50 people in the room. In Mumbai, it's also happening where the banks are getting very active to work with fintech startups. Shanghai is a funny one. Shanghai, you see a lot of startups, but especially all these tech giants like Alipay and Tencent coming up with a lot of fintech ideas. It's less the startup side, it's more like the existing incumbents doing a lot of fintech activity. On the right, the exciting bits. Philippines, as I said, it's huge for Bitcoin. Philippines, last year December was the first time where there was more Bitcoin transferred into the Philippines than US dollars. Very interesting. There must be a certain thing going on in the Philippines that people trust more the Bitcoin than the US dollar. Very similar to Myanmar. After the government changed to Myanmar, the Bitcoin activity Bitcoin activity increased by 120%. So there is, in these emerging markets, there's a new layer of trust towards financial system, towards currencies, that new solutions like Bitcoin are more in favor. Indonesia is fourth largest country of the world, and I live next door in Singapore, so it's exciting to see what's going on. And Thailand. It's all these countries where e-commerce is happening, where people want to shop online with their mobile phone, very device-based. They don't have a bank account, can't have loans. So we have all these, a mismatch of internet and then existing infrastructure. It doesn't work out. So then in between is fintech. We see this happening. Summarizing opportunities in Asia, opportunities are definitely the tier 2 and tier 3 banks. The banks in these new markets that don't want to be left behind of HSBC, Deutsche Bank, these large, huge worldwide banks that really have a lot of legacy. They have a very innovative CEO and have a huge innovation department, but they don't know what to do. But then tier 2 and tier 3 banks are the ones actually that are trying to catch up and trying to work with startups. So we always say, if you're a fintech startup, go to these smaller banks. It's most likely that you convince the teams easier to work with you as a startup than go to a global bank. Governments, as I said, huge opportunity. Consumers are ready. And, bottom point, investment. There is a lot of cash available for fintech startups. We talk to a lot of investors, or they actually talk to us, and they want to invest in fintech startups. It's next big thing. If you're a startup, go out now and raise money. I would really say it's the best time. In our cohort, I just said earlier, the 10 teams, 2 of the 10 are already now in week 3 raising $1 million. So it's going crazy. The challenges. Yesterday, John Walker also asked me on the panel, what would I advise the fintech startup to do? Get mentors. Ask for advice. Ask people in the bank, what do you think about the solution? Go to regulators. Can I get your advice on this? Get smart money. Get people around you that understand the industry, that understand compliance, that understand the procurement process of the bank. Get mentors from the banking industry to help you as a startup. I think it's very important. And we don't see these many mentors yet. One of the main reasons why we're in Singapore is a very active community of fintech people that like to be mentors. We had a mentor fest in March in Singapore with 180 people. 180 people wanting to be a mentor with our 10 teams. That's great. That's what we need. A few, and like probably something very common globally, but I see it a lot in Asia, is fintech startups are lacking the go-to-market knowledge or the go-to-market strategy. How do you actually acquire the first customer or the first 10? What do you do with the growth hacking? How do you get to the 100,000 customers? I think a lot of times fintech startups are very technology-driven, a very good product, but then are lacking the business skills to actually go to market and get out there. And this is something for the banks, and I keep saying this, the challenge really is, if you're a fintech startup, you can convince the innovation department, you can convince the CEO because he gets excited or she gets excited about this, but then as a fintech startup, you get stuck in the mid-level management. There are a lot of people in the bank still who are very risk-averse in the mid-level to not allow innovation happening. So our role as Startupbootcamp Fintech is to exactly go into the bank, into the mid-level management, and drive cultural change. I think also that's the whole community of Fintech is doing this now, trying to bring the bankers outside the building, take them to events like this, or next week is Next Bank Asia in Singapore, where the whole industry meets and actually understand what's going on with innovation. In Singapore, we are very exciting. The regulators, the MAS, is part of our program. The MAS is coming every week for 2 hours into our program to meet the startups. Imagine 2 regulators in suits and ties coming to a co-working space for 2 hours to learn, listen to startups. I think it's a unique and it's a great opportunity for the startup to pick a brain of a regulator and a regulator to learn what actually is a startup, how can they change, adjust regulations. So anyway we're doing, it's always about bringing the stakeholders, regulators, investors, banks, startups, government on the table in the same room and get them talking so we can overcome these bloody challenges. Thank you. Hello.
Thank you very much. I think much better than yesterday. I don't know why.
Different audience here.
Please practice. Practice.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to ask you guys a question. I'd rather, some getting the question from the people. So I already asked a lot of questions to you guys.
Question to JP. I'm an angel investor. Actually invest already two startups here, Fintech as well as Startupbootcamp. My question is, I haven't done with what is your opinion about with regard to how the U.S.-based regulators react to the Fintech? When I look at the history of the U.S. banking regulations with regard to the P2P lending, it's been sort of push, and then they will get pushed back, and then it's been constant battle with the state charter authorities, getting the state charts clearance, and this is a battle. Has that gotten better, or is it still a battle there?
Yeah, so the question is about the regulatory environment, particularly in the U.S. So let me say that regulation always lags innovation. It's just the way it is, right? And if we left it to our regulators to innovate, we wouldn't be very happy. And we probably wouldn't be very happy if we let our innovators regulate either.
Right.
So it is a battle. And so we're seeing things like Ripple, right? That has, I think technically it's a blockchain-oriented technology, right? And Ripple Labs is focused on more like interbank payments and so on. Well, the United States FinCEN, one of the parts of regulators, just levied a $770,000 fine on them because they said under the definition of the U.S. law, they're what's called a money service business, and they didn't register. So I think we're going to see more of that, of these companies that are innovating out on the edge. The regulators will kind of, reach out and grab that. But at the same time, I can tell you that one part, when we say the regulators, and I think it's simpler in Singapore, right? It's MAS, right? In the U.S., there are probably 8 different groups that have something to say about it. And the newest one is called the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They are focused on the consumer protection side. So when you think about regulation, there's really 2 major parts. The first is protecting the safety and the soundness of the banking system. That makes all the sense in the world, right? We shouldn't take big, risky bets with shareholder capital and with depositors, insured deposits. The other part of regulation is about this consumer protection, and it gets a lot stickier there because, as I'm much more of a free market person, I'm not looking for someone to protect me. I want opportunity, right, to do the things. I talked about Uber earlier. Look at Uber versus taxis. Well, the people that drive taxis aren't very happy with Uber. And so they hide behind regulations and they talk about, well, the consumers aren't protected, because the cars aren't inspected and this and that and the other. Yet every single Uber experience I've had has been better than probably any taxi experience I've ever had. I don't need to be protected from that. I don't want to be protected, right? So there is definitely a battle going on. Your question was, is it getting better? Yes and no. What I was starting to say about the CFPB is they are sending people to shows like Money 2020 and Finovate. I actually was just on the phone with the White House last week. Somebody, a special assistant to President Obama, is reaching out to fintech leaders in America and asking our opinion about things and wanting to know which regulations are getting in the way and so on. So I'm sorry, it was a horribly long answer, but I have a lot to say about regulation. And the short answer is, in some cases it's getting better. In some cases, fintech entrepreneurs should expect it to get worse. Places that didn't see regulation impact them before will likely see it in the future.
Just to add on this, like any other bank would say, probably regulation is very, very costly for banks. Banks spend a lot of money for regulations. So do startups now. It's a very famous Bitcoin exchange, just raised $20 million. They spent probably several millions on lobbying regulators. So a lot of startups, especially in Bitcoin, they're very well funded, spend a lot of money in lobbying the regulators. And this is especially in the States. The recent Ripple Labs just announced yesterday 28 million investment. And the CEO will spend it on a huge compliance team to actually get compliant. So it will be a very costly game for the startups to be regulated. If you look at the funding rounds startups do now, and also our 10 teams, there's a big cost point every time there. When you raise money from investors, the biggest chunk will go to your compliance department in a startup.
Depends on the
Sure, but most every kind of fintech startup has to touch regulation at some point. So they always need to look into this.
Yeah, we call it Fintech. So one side is financial, the other side is technology. So which part we more put emphasis on way more, and you can explain like this. You have 10 children, 10 companies, and then what is their background, where they come from?
So the average age of the founders in our 10 teams is 32 years old. 32, yeah. So it ranges all the way from 21 years old to, I think, 51, our grandpa. So, yeah. So,
Hey.
sorry. And the average background you can see, normally it's a person who worked in the financial industry for 5, 6, 7 years, or consultancy, and then left this proper job to actually start a startup. So they had an experience in the so Dragon Wealth, for example, he was an ex-CEO of Credit Suisse Wealth Management. He has a very good experience with wealth management. Wanted to do Dragon Wealth within Credit Suisse, didn't get it through, so well, just do it myself. So that's very, very common. You have only one team, Scholar Fund, which is a student team. The typical students in a garage building a next big thing, with only one team. All the other 9 actually have experience from finance industry.
So just to build on that thought, I was at Finovate last week. Are people familiar with Finovate? It's the world's largest demo-based financial show. It's been around 8 years now. And I saw 32 companies over 2 days. I was standing at the end of day 2 talking to a pretty experienced person. And we were talking about, not all the companies were really good in their pitch. When I hear a pitch, I really want to understand. So, first of all, building on your question, is it fin or is it tech? Neither or both, or who cares, right? It's really what problem are you solving for what customers, and show me how you're solving that problem better than the alternatives that exist today. But then tying into the age range, so I'm talking to a guy about my age and saying not all these are very good pitching. And this kid that looked to be about 12 years old came up to me. And if I'm charitable, maybe he looked 16. And so I introduced myself, and I said, well, tell me what you do. And he gave me an excellent pitch. He described exactly about the problems with trade finance. And in fact, I believe they're using the blockchain to solve some of the problems with trade finance. And it was excellent. And he connected on LinkedIn, and I looked under education. He only had his secondary school, from which he graduated early this year. So he probably is about 16 years old. And he gave probably the best pitch I heard over 2 days. So, yeah, so we've got a wide range. And I am the grandpa there.
The ideal team we describe, the ideal team of a fintech startup is an experienced banker, let's say mid-30s and 30s. And then on the other side, you have the hacker, some kind of graduate, who actually is the entrepreneurial mindset. Because even though you've worked in a bank maybe only for 5 years, you already have this whole process thinking. And you put together with a graduate student who can hack things away, they get a hustler. So the 3, we always say hipster, hustler, and hacker. This is a perfect team. So if you have a hustler, the banker, you have a hacker, which is a graduate, and then you have a hipster, which is a product designer, this is the perfect team.
Yeah, and I will say we do believe in the fresh mind hypothesis. And I have 20 years in the banking experience, and in many ways that makes me a worse innovator than a lot of the people I met, probably the 16-year-old that I just met. Because you get locked into, well, this is the way we do things. No, you can't do that because the regulators will allow you or this or that or the other. Now, You may end up there at the end, but that's not how we should start, right? We should start with a really clear vision, unblemished by all of these scars that I have in 20 years in the industry. And so, yeah, I think the hackers and the hipsters.
Should we start a comedy together?
Yeah, there we go. Who's the hipster? I don't know. I forgot who I saw. Maybe I'll serve 2 roles.
So you guys are perfect match.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Are there anybody from the bank?
Any other questions?
Can I go?
I was in the conference yesterday where I remember that Jack Ma's analogy saying that the success of Alibaba in China largely owes to the lack of infrastructure, shopping infrastructure in China. Whereas in the States, because the offline shopping infrastructure has been so well established, the e-commerce was just supplementary in the States. Likewise, in Korea, I'm from banking as well. The smartphone banking, so-called smartphone banking, and all the other sectors are so competitive. For example, the fees, transaction fees are comparably very low. And there are many lenders, so-called savings banks. They are not real banks, but there are so many lenders, and you can just borrow money just at one phone call in 1 minute. And so I've been following the internet for a couple of months, and actually the conventional bankers are interested in, but they just don't know. They just can't figure out how to make some business models that can make the internet bank survive for a long time. So is there any your insights and advices to make the
Yeah, so first, wasn't it great hearing Jack Ma yesterday?
Yeah.
He was really fascinating. And have you heard of Peter Thiel? He was one of the founders of PayPal. And he wrote
He did it here.
Yes?
He did it in Korea, and we had our event here.
Oh, nice. So I hope you've read his book, 0 to 1. And, Jack Ma is a 0 to 1 kind of business. Many of the businesses that were, meaning it didn't exist before, and then they created it. And in a mature market like the United States, very much like Korea, there aren't as many of those opportunities. They do still exist, right? But there are probably a lot more one-to-many kind of opportunities. There's the first, and then there are the rest. And so, as an investor, Peter Thiel's thesis is he wants the 0 to 1 investments. And so he likes the Jack Ma kind of story, right, and the Chinese story. But there's still plenty of opportunities. And I think, I don't know, I've not had a banking experience in Korea. I don't know what it's like. But I suspect there are still many opportunities for improvement.
It's their side of you, not our
Yeah.
That's true.
Bankers view.
Yeah.
But I'm running a startup now. I feel banking.
So a fellow ex-banker, as I like to call myself, a recovering banker.
Yes.
So, I suspect there's still plenty of opportunities, right, and again, I'll go back to what I said a minute ago. If you really are clear about what problem you're solving and for whom, right, and you think about, the value proposition model is a really pretty simple 3-part model. What gains, who are you solving it for, right? And this person, is it a consumer, is it a small business owner, is it a working mother, whoever it might be? What gains are they looking for? What pains are they trying to eliminate? And what jobs do they need done? And I think if you apply that filter across many product categories that exist today, you'll probably find a lot of opportunities where there are still pains to be eliminated, there's still gains unyet realized, and there are jobs to be done that aren't getting done. So if you look at the way your customers are actually behaving, not just what they tell you, but what they actually do, one of the great things is to look for what we call workaround. It's kind of an Americanism, if that makes sense, but it's a shortcut, maybe, right? So the product is supposed to work like this, but I don't like that, so I go over here and I do something else. I have a workaround, or a shortcut, those are great opportunities for new products because the current product doesn't really work the way I want it. So I have to use a second product or a third product or a shortcut or, I customize it myself or whatever it is. There are plenty of those opportunities.
Can I just add one more statement?
Yes.
Answering your question. I've been following the internet bank,
Yes.
as I just told you, for a couple of months. And the insight I found is somewhat different from my expectation at the first. Was that many people think that the regulatory issue may be the biggest obstacle for building up an internet bank in Korea. But this month, the government said that they will allow confirming the identification in no-facing. It literally lifts, the most biggest regulatory obstacle. But what I found is actually technology obstacle is very overlooked in Korea. You said the mobile, and I looked at what the features of mobile bank. There are so many technologies that actually haven't been done in Korea. So can I give us a brief pitch? Yeah, no. It's
We're going to pitch day here?
spending gauge. It's a snapshot how fast you are spending compared to previous months. And the other thing is money purse, individual transactions with visual cues, changing colors, comparing previous your behavior, something like that. There are not many fintech companies that can do this. And traditionally in Korea, some big companies like SKCNC, LGCN, these are like Fiserv and FIS in the States. They've been outsourced by the conventional banks. But they are now trying to find somebody who have done these technologies. So without these kind of distinctive services, the internet bank cannot make difference from the conventional banks. So what I found is actually in Korea there is huge obstacle which is technology, but nobody thinks they could be problem in Korea. So.
But I have great confidence that technological obstacles will be quite easy for Koreans to overcome. You've overcome many, many technological obstacles in other industries. I suspect that will not be an issue. Go ahead.
Can't agree more.
Yeah,
But
but
it's really easy.
yeah, for Korea. Let me say the problem is that the banking industry do not know how they are or that's the problem.
That's true in every country I've been to, by the way.
Okay, let's take 2 more questions because it's already past 1 o'clock.
The question for Markus. I agree with your view that the blockchain technology will be disruptive and it will change a lot. So from the 3 companies with the blockchain, is any of them dealing more the Bitcoin itself or they only focus on blockchain? And if so, what's the difference with those 3 companies that are focusing?
Yeah, good question. So we on purpose didn't take any Bitcoin company because there's a lot of issues around it, especially with our partners. DBS and MasterCard would not ever touch anything Bitcoin. Yeah, they would not even the press talk about this. Yeah. So also Bitcoin is something I think we're not really sure about how it's going to be evolved anyway, but blockchain. And I mentioned autonomous, which is using blockchain to govern and fund companies on the blockchain, which is simply basically tokenizing the incorporation of companies. There is a Bitcoin somewhere in the back, which is actually just used for the transaction, but is not actually as a currency value. Take Crypto Sigma, another team, which is a TransferWise, but on a blockchain, which is an auto exchange in Singapore and Hong Kong, where I transfer my Singapore dollars into the auto exchange, but I don't see that they will actually then convert it to Bitcoin and then use the Bitcoin blockchain as a transaction to transfer the Bitcoin actually to Hong Kong, where it's exchanged back into local Hong Kong dollars. But me as a consumer, I won't see anything of the Bitcoin thing. I will only see that it costs almost nothing. And so where TransferWise states to be 80% cheaper than the banking infrastructure, Crypto Sigma is 100%, almost 100% cheaper. So they only charge 0.01% or something like this, and because there are no costs involved, because it's just Bitcoin. But as an example is that Bitcoin is just a token of value, but not a currency. And then the other one is the Ebony, which is also in the trade finance space, dematerializing invoices. Trade finance, we have a lot of invoices per container coming into the port of Singapore. Yeah? Every good, mobile phones, anything has an invoice to it as a piece of paper. And they will then dematerialize the invoice on the blockchain. And then the Bitcoin is used basically to store information on the Bitcoin, which will then transferred on the blockchain. I hope that makes sense. It's quite technical. But so again, what I'm trying to say, Bitcoin is just literally a coin with information on it, value, information of the invoice, so on and so on, and it's used across the blockchain. But the main concept is to be traceable. So you can trace everything on the blockchain, and you have a lot of trust, and you can't cheat. So I think this is the thing now. I mean, the blockchain has so much more than just a currency level to it, and it's about having this mediated, decentralized network of miners to actually justify and authenticate the transaction step by step.
Yeah. Then for the second company, the
Sigma.
self-supervised model, is currently many countries regulated as a kind of illegal transfer of money. So is it okay in Singapore regulation?
Yeah, they're right now figuring this out. They're talking to the regulators a lot.
Yeah.
And it looks like there will be a money transmitting service as a regulation.
Yeah. So if it got
Current
bigger,
regulated,
it might
yeah.
cause problem.
Yeah.
두 분, 세 분 받고 끝내겠습니다. D부터 해주세요.
You spoke earlier about the impact of regulations on these startup fintech companies. My question is, do you think that as more and more fintech companies become larger and kind of gain the attention of these regulators, will they be kind of be taken into the already pre-existing financial regulation framework, or will there be a new set of laws and new set of regulations created just for these financial tech companies?
I mean, my point of view, it's a very short answer. I encourage startups to push the barriers and regulations. Yeah? Bloody hell, go for it. Yeah? Go for it and ask regulation to, as I say in Singapore, it's a good example. It works there. It doesn't say it works anywhere else, but try to adjust regulations for your benefit. Yeah? And it's not always the standard rule, but again, in London, it was that the regulations and kind of the peer-to-peer lending or crowdfunding, one of the famous examples in the UK, where startups started this company without regulatory framework, but then the regulatory framework adapted to these new trends because I couldn't stop it anymore. So it's really having a conversation from day one, talk to regulators as soon as possible, but then go to the gray zones. Go into the gray zones. That's my point of view, but it's very extreme.
Yeah, my answer is yes, both. As the companies get bigger, they will attract attention of the regulators, and the first attempt will be to squeeze them into the existing regulations, just like Ripple Labs. But I think over time, the regulations will evolve and new ones will happen. And of course, in the United States especially, it's an extremely political process too, right? We have Elizabeth Warren, who was the founder of the CFPB, who is now a U.S. Senator, and would probably declare a run for president, except she probably can't beat Hillary Clinton. But she's, in my opinion, very politically motivated. And then there are the whole other people on the other side of the aisle who are very much enablers to Wall Street, and that's not necessarily a good thing either. There's a lot of cronyism that happens there, but then the response is a lot of populism around, don't worry, we'll protect you. And so, we're in the we're in the rebar stages of regulation too.
Just one more thing to this. Banks have been so far using regulation as an excuse not to innovate, and also banks, especially Indonesia, Colombo, for example, using regulators to not enforce fintech. But now banks are investing into fintech startups. Goldman Sachs just did a 40 million round. And as soon as banks invest in fintech startups, I'm sure they will not actually have a startup shut down by regulators they invested in. So I think there will be banks and fintech startups together against regulators.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing, because I agree with that too. And it's that, yeah, we have a lot to say. I'll tell you a strategy that doesn't work if you're a bank. Trying to get the regulators to punish the startups, to say, well, that's not fair, you want to make them subject to the same rules that we're subject to. I think in some cases that will work, but it's not a strategy to just say, well, don't worry about all those upstarts because they'll get regulated out of existence. I don't think that's going to work at all.
Okay, next.
Yeah, I'm interested in the crowdfunding, especially in real estate industry. So could you explain the market situation or change effectiveness due to the crowdfunding site, like the Realty Mogul or Realty Share and Grain Broker like that?
I can just give an example from UK, where crowdfunding is booming. We have 126 crowdfunding websites in the UK, and regulations are very easy for crowdfunding because you don't have to be an accredited investor to actually do crowdfunding. You can, as an individual, put £10 into a company that's already crowdfunded. Different in the States.
Yeah, so, I know Realty Mogul. I've seen them at Finovate a couple of times, and it's another space that's evolving. I'm also seeing some companies now that are making it easier. If you are an accredited investor, it's easier to share that information and to get access to things. But I think the trend is what Marcus just described. It's really democratizing it, making it easier to be able to get small shares of things. So I think there's going to be a lot more there. The last thing I would say is, in most cases, it's not crowdfunding. As I mentioned earlier, this whole P2P, most of the P2P lenders now call themselves marketplace lenders. And I think that's what's happening in a lot of the crowdfunding things too. It's not so much crowd, it's really institutional money, but it still kind of lowers the barriers to entry and is a good thing in my opinion.
Okay, the last question.
Thank you for both of you. The great presentation. And Marcus mentioned 5 strong cities in terms of Fintech: Singapore, Seoul, Shanghai, Mumbai, and Hong Kong, right? Yeah. So because Startupbootcamp was started in Singapore over other cities, and live Sweden, the Russian VC, Russian VC just moved its headquarters to Singapore. So what advantages does Singapore have in terms of Fintech over other cities?
For us, there has to be 3 elements to go to a new ecosystem. So we've done it in London now, and then it was a question, what next? And we thought about Hong Kong or Singapore in this case. And 3 elements for us were in Singapore: startups. We have a lot of fintech startups in Hong Kong, and in Singapore, sorry, and both actually. So in Singapore, there are now more than 80 fintech startups coming up. A few very early stage ones, but also actually a few later stage ones. This is one element, startups, obviously. Second one is investment. We have a lot of investors in Singapore, South Asia, more than in Hong Kong, that actually want to do fintech deals and actually understand fintech, which is very important, the smart money bit I mentioned earlier. And thirdly, it's a community. It's a community of mentors, of angels, of advisors that would like to work with startups. And Hong Kong wasn't really ready for this. And then also, to be frank, the Singapore government invested in us within 4 weeks. It was a very quick deal. And Hong Kong took 6 months. What would have taken 6 months? So was okay, let's go to Singapore now. But it doesn't mean that we wouldn't go anywhere else. I mean, we probably, like I said earlier, we are expanding ourselves, but it's really the community bit that really matters to us. We can help the startups as much as we want, but it's the community around us that is helping the teams to grow quicker. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Okay, thank you very much. Today's discussion was much more
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
than yesterday. Thank you very